history of Canada in 10 lessons, entitled How Did Canada Change After World War II? Before we go much further, I just want to say thank you for paying attention and participating in these lessons the entire time we've been going through them. I know some of them have been pretty difficult, but you guys have done awesome, and I'm so proud to have you in my class. Okay, grade 5, let's pick up with what happened right at the end of World War II, which ended in 1945. It says, peace at last. At the end of World War II, Canada had a huge army, navy, and air force. However, most of the veterans soon returned to life as civilians. This meant they returned to ordinary life. So again, a veteran is someone who's done from the army, who was in the army or the air force or the navy, and a civilian is someone who's not a soldier. The economy began to improve after the war, so many people married and had large families. We call their children part of the baby boom generation, because the population grew so fast then. So for some of you, your grandparents were probably part of the baby boom. My parents were part of the baby boom because they were born in the 1960s. And at that time, people were having families of 5, 6, 7 kids because, hey, things were going really well. People had great jobs. The economy was expanding. For a lot of people, the 1950s and the 1960s were a real time of prosperity, at least here in Canada. Here is our Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, in 1960, and he's expressing some of the confidence that Canadians felt at this time. And he says, I am a Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, or free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind. And he was Canada's first Prime Minister who was neither French nor British in his background. He was a German Canadian, and he was a conservative, and he actually won the election. People would call him Dief the Chief, with the biggest kind of landslide win in history, in Canadian history. And the thing about him is that he's kind of expressing this vision of Canada as a country of freedom, a country where people can be happy, because they've got the ability to make their choices without too much control from the government. Now that was important because at this time, in the 1950s and 60s, many immigrants came over after the war from Europe because so much of that continent was destroyed. Now another group of immigrants came as refugees because the communist Soviet Union had taken over much of Eastern Europe and was oppressing the people there. So we talked a little bit about what communism means last week, but basically it's kind of when the government tries to control everything. In the economy and also in people's kind of political lives, so they have a lot less personal freedom. And a lot of people really liked it at first because it promised that what you would do is you'd make things more equal. But it tended to produce a lot of oppression. And if you look at this map here, all the countries in blue are capitalist, so more free, not perfect by any means, especially not a country like Spain here, but the rest of them, Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, these countries were all controlled kind of by the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of oppression, a lot of unfair treatment. So for example, this is an image of refugees from Hungary, which is a country in the eastern part of Europe, controlled by the communists. Refugees from Hungary came to Canada after their communist government crushed their peaceful protests in 1956. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was another big wave of European immigration, people leaving the continent that had been kind of destroyed by the war, but also, people who were leaving the oppression of communism in Eastern Europe. Another thing that was happening at this time is what's called decolonization. And there was also what's called the Cold War, which is how we kind of describe the war. And it wasn't a real fighting war. It was more kind of just tensions and disagreement between the capitalist democratic West and then the communist eastern part of Europe. In any case, decolonization and the Cold War. Despite the existence of the United Nations, there was a lot of conflict around the world, even after World War II. Many colonies became independent of their former empires in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So if you look at this map here, this map is kind of interesting, and it shows every country that at some point was under European control. So every country in green has at some point been under the control of a European country. The countries in purple are in Europe. The countries in yellow, were not fully controlled by Europe, but definitely influenced by it. And then the countries in orange have never been fully colonized by Europe. And so what you see here is just this idea that Europe, the European countries had these giant worldwide empires, but after 1945, after World War II, in the 50s and the 60s, there was a real effort to kind of do what's called decolonization. So you break up these big empires and then you put them back into independent countries. Just like Canada used to be in the British Empire, and then we became independent. The rest of the world started to do the same. For example, India, Jamaica, and Nigeria left the British Empire and joined the Commonwealth as independent countries. So this map here shows kind of the state of the world's remaining empires in 1945. So you have, for example, all the pink countries are within the British Empire as dominions. So you've got Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada. And so they're within the British Empire, but they're a little more independent. And the red countries are governed directly from London. So for example, here is India and Pakistan, which are two of the world's biggest countries by population, and they are being governed directly from London over here in England. So in decolonization, India and Pakistan left the British Empire and became independent. So Indians and Pakistanis could finally run kind of their own affairs. And the same thing happened in Nigeria, in Jamaica, in Belize, in Kenya, in all sorts of countries that had been controlled by the British. And the same thing happened with the French Empire. So you notice that much of Northwest Africa is French. You notice Madagascar, Vietnam, controlled by the French Empire, and those countries also got their independence. And so they became, independent of the European control. And we call that process decolonization, the opposite of colonization. Now, you know how I said that there was what we call that Cold War between the communist East and the capitalist West? I want to give you a bit more information on kind of the two different systems. So we call our system, the system that we live in, a liberal democracy. Now that doesn't mean like Liberal Party of Canada necessarily. It kind of just means like liberal, liberty, freedom. So both our parties in Canada, liberal and conservative, are all liberal in the sense that they believe in freedom. And then on the other side, there was communist dictatorships. So let's talk a little bit about what our kind of system was like, right? And our system, to be clear, was not perfect, and it wasn't free for everybody, but this is kind of what our system said that it was about. So our system of government, there was citizens had the right to vote, to elect their government in free elections, right to vote to choose their government in free elections. There was a peaceful transfer of power. So sometimes the liberals would win, sometimes the conservatives would win, and go back and forth, and people had the right to vote and choose freely. And nobody would punish you if you voted for the party, that was not your party. Whereas in a communist dictatorship, so like in this case, we're talking about countries like China, we're talking about countries like the Soviet Union. What it would happen is there are no free elections, so you don't get to choose your leaders. The only legal political party is the Communist Party, so they run the country without kind of consultation of any other kind. There are no free elections. The only legal political party in the Communist Party, the same man governs usually until he dies. So, for example, there was like Stalin in the Soviet Union, and then there was Mao in China. And so you can see how there's a real difference there. One is like an election-based system. The other is kind of dictatorship, right? And there's a dictator who's running the show. Now, there's the other difference with it are the type of economy. So in a capitalist, liberal, democratic country, you have private property rights, and free markets. So that means, you can kind of set up your own store, you can set up your own business, and the government doesn't control it all. Much more wealthy as a result, because, if people are just allowed to set up their own business and, own their own land and own their own things, often they're pretty good at producing things, and we became quite wealthy. Much more wealthy, but with high inequality. And what that means is that, sometimes some people do better than others. And that means that some people end up living, being a lot richer than other people. And that is a feature of our system even today. Right? That's, just something about living in Canada, living in a liberal democracy. And, people say probably about the same thing about, say, the United States, which is also a liberal democracy. But in a communist dictatorship, the government controls all the property and businesses, usually, or always actually, much less wealthy and productive, because honestly it doesn't work very well, but more equal. So the government would say, okay, this is how much we're going to pay you, and we're going to pay you, and we're going to pay you. But I'm going to put equal in quotation marks here, because the thing was, they said it was about equality in terms of everyone's going to get paid a similar amount of money, and it's not going to be based on, just who your parents are, or how good an education you got, or whatever. It's going to be based on just what you need. But the truth is that what actually happened is that if you knew, if your parents were important, say they were big-time members of the Communist Party, then you were going to have a much better life than if your parents were not big-time members of the Communist Party. And people who were important in the system tended to do much better economically. So that means that they had a better quality of life. Like, they might own a car, whereas a regular person might not. And just so you know, you should be copying some of this down. You can copy it down in point form, so it doesn't need to be the exact same, but copy it down, please. Now, last section is personal freedoms. And what I mean by that is, like, what are people just kind of allowed to do? So I'm going to say freedom of speech. So in our system, you're allowed to say, I don't like Justin Trudeau, or I do like Justin Trudeau, or you can criticize the person in charge, or you can support them. On the other side, no, you can't. So no freedom of speech. Similarly, in our system, you can be of any religion or no religion, right? So freedom of speech, religion, assembly. What that means, you can have a protest, speech, religion, assembly, and conscience. Conscience means you're allowed to believe what you like. Equal treatment before the law. Now again, I'm going to put equal here in quotation marks because we say that's what we believe in, but at this time, like the 1950s and 1960s, for example, like Indigenous people could not vote. So we say equal, that's what we believe in, but we didn't always live up to it. Freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and conscience, equal treatment before the law, right to vote. Right, people were allowed to vote to choose their thing. No freedom of choose their government. On this side, though, communist dictatorships, no freedom of speech, religion, assembly, or conscience. Secret police and courts. So people were not necessarily treated fairly by the law, and they could be sent off. Prison camps. And government spying. So the government would spy on their own people to make sure that there was nobody plotting a rebellion. So these are all kind of things that were happening in this side. So you can probably tell, my view is that the liberal democracies are considerably better than the communist dictatorships. And I think most people would agree with that. But at the time, people were really worried about how unequal our system had become. And so they were willing to kind of give a shot to a different system that promised to make things more equal. And so you can kind of understand why people were at first saying, okay, well, maybe we'll give this communism thing a shot, even if, as they tried it, they found that it led to a lot of oppression and a lot of mistreatment of people, and it didn't end up making people more equal anyways. Okay, so liberal democracies, that's our system. Communist dictatorships, that's like Soviet Union, China, that sort of thing. And let's keep going. So the United States led most of the world's liberal democracies, while the Soviet Union, that used to be Russia, but there was a revolution, communists took over, while the Soviet Union led most of the world's communist dictatorships. China had a communist revolution in 1949, and Mao Zedong became the leader of China for the rest of his life. He did not hold elections and oppressed many of his people, though some people still liked him because they thought he made China more powerful. So you can think Russia and China were on kind of one side, where on the other side you've got like France, Britain, Canada, the United States, West Germany. You've got many countries that are more on that democratic side, but then on the other side you have two very powerful countries, China and Russia, or the Soviet Union, that were on the side of the communist dictatorships. So I want to give you an example of kind of what was happening in some of these places. And I think this is kind of the worst, but also saddest example. In the 1950s, Mao, remember he's the communist dictator of China, created a policy called the Great Leap Forward, which aimed to make China a more modern country. This meant putting most of the economy's energy into producing metal and weapons, and taking peasant farmers' land and forcing them to work on state-run farms. Tens of millions of poor Chinese people starved during this policy. And so the idea was, we're going to make China great. We're going to make it a strong country by having the government run all the farms, run all the factories. And it was a disaster, an absolute total disaster. Tens of millions of people starved to death from this guy here. So, he's on this poster, he's a smiling figure, he's like, oh, yes, yeah, communism. But tens of millions of people, like an incredible, tragic, and evil destruction of human life in order for this kind of vanity project, in order to just make himself look good. So it wasn't a great leap forward, really. It was more of a great leap backward. But that's because, frankly, communists didn't really care as much about human life and protecting it. Certainly not Mao. So let's look at a list of countries that were more on the liberal democratic side. I'm just going to put down a few on each one. So the United Kingdom, United States, of course Canada, France, West Germany. We sometimes refer to these countries as the West, but it also included countries like Japan. And, Japan had become a democracy after World War II, committed to stay peaceful, and kind of joined our kind of alliance here. Whereas on the other side, you've got countries like China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, Cuba. Poland was controlled by the communists. The Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And there were some countries that were kind of in the middle, and they tried to stay neutral in this big war, this Cold War between the two sides. So like India would be a really good example of those. And you can kind of understand why, because they had just freed themselves from the British. So they were like, nope, we're not going back on your side, even if India was a democracy. So the Cold War was considered cold because there was never any direct fighting between the US and the Soviet Union. And this may have been because both countries worried that the other side could destroy them with nuclear weapons. So the Cold War is cold because, you're not necessarily fighting back and forth between the US and the Soviets. There were just like little smaller wars here and there, but there was never any direct fighting between the two big countries. And the thing was probably because both countries had nukes, nuclear weapons, and a nuclear weapon can kill a huge number of people. So both sides were very reluctant. They didn't want to get into it because they were worried about what would happen. Now, one major hotspot in the Cold War was the Korean War. This was a war between the communist North Korea and the capitalist South Korea. Now, Canada fought with our allies to keep South Korea a capitalist country after the communist North invaded. And this kind of shows you the effect if you look at this map here. Today, South Korea is a rich and democratic country, while North Korea is one of the poorest and most oppressive countries in the world. And if you're not sure what this is, so this is a satellite image taken at nighttime, and it basically shows where the electricity is. And I'll just kind of circle a few things. So this is Japan. It's quite a rich country, lots of lights on at nighttime. This is China today, quite a rich country. Here's like Shanghai, here's Beijing. Lots of light at night. That means there's a lot of businesses and that kind of thing. There's lights in the ocean from ships. And then here's South Korea, again, a very rich country, very prosperous, doing really well. It's a democracy. And here's North Korea, a communist dictatorship. There's only a few lights on, and the reason for that is that North Korea is a profoundly poor and oppressed country, whereas South Korea is a rich and democratic country. So today, South Korea is a rich and democratic Korea, while North Korea is one of the poorest and most oppressive countries in the world. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to kind of life back on the home front here in Canada. So after the war, the world's liberal democracies, including Canada, grew very wealthy. Regular people were finally able to afford more technologies, including inexpensive tickets on flights, affordable cars with cheap gas, television sets to keep at home. These technologies help to change the ordinary life for millions of people by raising their quality of life. And what I'd like you to do in this part, where it says doodle, just draw a little picture of, plane maybe, car, TV set. But, sometimes in this, I talk a lot about like what's going on with our leaders and our prime ministers and war. But the truth is, for most people, this is what mattered, right? Like for most people, whoa, I can go visit someone. Say I lived in Montreal and moved to Vancouver. I can go back and visit my parents in Montreal. That's a big change, right? You can get a flight across the country. You can go from Montreal to Vancouver in like 6 hours. Affordable cars? Wait, so I can live in Surrey and work in Vancouver? That's a big change because I own a car now. Or I can go on holiday somewhere else. That's a really big change. And television sets to keep at home. So wait, I can see the prime minister or the president or the pope talking on TV? Whoa. Or I can see a TV show that kind of just wants to be entertaining to me. Those are big changes from what was there before. Now you might be saying, but wait, you told us flight was invented back in the early 1900s and that cars were around even in the late 1800s. Yes, that is true. But what changed in the 1950s and 60s is they got a lot cheaper. So a lot more people were able to kind of enjoy these technologies. So there was a real change in that sense. Okay. Another thing that changed for ordinary people was that the society changed. So after the war, a major movement called feminism challenged traditional ideas of the relationship between men and women. Feminists argued that women should be more in control of their own lives and choices and should be treated equally to men. And this poster here says, "She serves that men may fly. Enlist today in the Royal Canadian Air Force." And the truth is that World War II and the war contributed to the feminist movement because all these women had gone into service to kind of help out the country and also to make sure that we were able to kind of produce things even while the men were off in Europe fighting. But after, a lot of them were like, well, we don't want to go back necessarily to just kind of staying at home. And some of them stayed in the workforce, and that really changed our society. And I'll show you just the first change here. So you look at this figure 1, this graph. If you look at this for a minute, you'll notice that it says the percent of the population working outside of the home. And actually, I should say percentage to be grammatically correct. And you'll notice that from 1953 till 2013, the percent of women working in the home has gone from like 25% to like, or working outside the home has gone from like 25% up to about a little more than 80%. And for men, it stayed from about 96% to about 90%. So it's declined slightly for men because more men are staying at home. And it's gone up way up for women. So we're now at the point where 4 out of 5 women in Canada is working outside the home, whereas it would have previously been 1 out of 5 women in Canada was working outside the home. And that's a real change in only about 50, 60 years from what used to be before. And just, to be clear, working at home, being a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad is hard work, You guys know how difficult you can be to raise. So I'm not saying it's, better. I'm just saying that it's different. So it's a real change that's happened in the last 50 years. So what I'm going to have you guys do is I'm going to have in this next section, it says figure 1 shows that, right? So on your sheet it says that. So let's write a sentence for what does figure 1 show? Figure 1 shows that. So you can write a sentence, but I'm going to give an example sentence up here, just in case you guys don't have one in your mind. Whoop, that's not it. Figure 1 shows that after World War II, the percentage of women working outside the home increased from about 25% to about 80%. Right? So it's basically saying, what does figure 1 show? Well, that's what it shows. Now that's one sentence, but you could put a different sentence that says something similar. Okay? So let's go on to our next graph here, figure 2. Canada also became a much more diverse country starting in the 1960s, when race-based immigration laws were changed to allow more non-European people to immigrate here. So I love this graph. It's very colorful, but it's also kind of difficult to figure out. So let me help you figure it out. So it says, Distribution in percentage of foreign-born population by place of birth, Canada, 1871 to 2011. And basically what it means is that of the people who live in Canada but weren't born here, where are they from? Well, if you look at 1871, it's this dark blue, this big column here, eh? And so that column refers to 83% were from the British Isles. That means Ireland and England and Scotland and Wales. So Britain, the British Isles. So 83-ish% were from the British Isles for people who lived here but weren't born here. There's a bit from Eastern Europe, so like Ukraine, Poland, but like less than 10%, and then a little bit from the United States. And then just a teeny bit from everywhere else, like Asia, Africa, all these other places, just a teeny bit. Oh wait, but you'll notice here, 1881, there's a bigger percentage of Americans, bigger percentage of Eastern Europeans, small Southern Europeans, it's like Italy. 1891, British go down again, there's more Eastern Europeans. 1901, way more Eastern Europeans, and you start to notice this green represents Asia, and a small, like 5% of the immigrants are starting to come over from like Asia. There's still this black bar. For most of our history, about 15% of the immigrants have been from the US, because they are our neighbor. But the key thing is, what I want you to notice is that the percentage of British immigration declined. So now it's less than 10%. Whereas previously it was about up at 85%. And then a bunch of different places in Europe, so these other blues are different places in Europe. And for a long time that was even more so than other British immigration. And then after 1961, by 1971, you start to notice is that the green represents Asia. So there's a lot more Asian immigration. And that includes East Asia, which would be like China, Japan, Korea. It includes South Asia, which would be like India, Southeast Asia, which would be like Vietnam and Thailand. And so you can notice that there's a lot more immigration from Asia. And then the red, yellow, and orange represent Africa, as well as the Caribbean, as well as South America. And you notice that there's a real increase in immigration from those places too. And so what that means is that our country became more diverse. There were a lot more people who were not from Europe who lived here starting in the 1960s, because before the government had been trying to exclude them, to say, no, we don't want you coming here. But after the 1960s, we said, if you can work, if you're smart, if you're talented, we want you. And that has changed our country. So let's put in a sentence. Figure 2 shows that after the 1960s, Canada began to welcome more non-European immigrants from Asia, Africa, South America, and the Caribbean. And Caribbean means like Cuba, Jamaica, all those countries down there. And that's just one sentence. That's an example sentence, but you can put more than a different sentence if you'd like, because I think it's an incredibly interesting thing. You could also comment on the percentage of new immigrants that come from Britain has declined from 82% to about 8%. Okay, third graph. These changes have made Canada one of the most multicultural and diverse countries on the planet. Now, much of this diversity is located in our major cities rather than our rural areas. For example, in Vancouver, 48% of the population are visible minorities, while over 90% of the population of Prince George, BC, that's way up north, are white or Indigenous. And what you'll notice here, so this is figure 3, and it shows from 1981 to about 2016, I guess 2021, the percentage change in the percentage of the population that's a visible minority. And what that means is somebody who is non-white or non-Indigenous, and you can see that they're not. So, they have an Asian complexion, or or they're black or something like that. So visible minority means that you can see that they're a minority. Because of course, there are people who are minorities in one way or another. Like, I'm Catholic, that's a minority religion. But you can't really see that just by looking at me, right? Anyways, visible minorities basically means people who are non-white in Canada. So in 1981, only about 5% of the population, that's 1 in 20 Canadians. Now, when I was born in 1992, it's about 10%. And when you guys are born in 2009, it's about 1 in 5. And then when you guys are born, and now in our year, it's about 1 in 4. So about 1 in 4 Canadians are non-white, and in about 15 years, it'll be about 1 in 3. So you can see the visible minority percentage of the population has increased and is continuing to increase, which I kind of think is a beautiful thing, because what it means is that our country isn't just for one kind of group of people, that it's for anybody who, comes here, shares our values, believes in the things that we believe in, and cares about the things that we care about, no matter the color of their skin, which is a beautiful thing. And for this one, I am not going to tell you what to write for figure 3, but I would like you to write in a sentence that describes what figure 3 shows. So figure 3 shows that blank. Okay? So fill that in. So we can be proud of our diverse country, which is teaching the rest of the world how people of different backgrounds can live together peacefully and in harmony. So if you take a look at this, this is a Canadian citizenship ceremony, and these are beautiful things to watch. I'm going to play a little bit of it.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Oh no. But you kind of get the point, grade 5. So after, you know what, actually, I'm going to go back and I'm going to play the end of that. I just misclicked.
And to fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. Congratulations, you all. You are now Canadian citizens.
And so that's actually the way it works, is these people, and you can see they're, just by looking at them, they're from all over the world. After they take that oath, they've now become Canadian citizens. And that means that, they are Canadian as I am or you are, and they are, equal in terms of their rights and all that sort of thing in our country. And before, they were not, and then they say the oath, and then they are. And of course, there's a whole big process by which people have to go through to become citizens, which you may have learned when you were doing your immigration interview. But for these people, they've now finished that process, and they've participated in this ceremony. And we're glad to have them. They're our neighbors, our fellow Canadians. Okay, we're going to shift off talking about immigration and talk about our flag. So in the 1960s, Canada was beginning to lessen. That means reduce, not like a lesson that I'm teaching, but like lessen, to reduce its connection to the British Empire. As part of that, many people began to argue that we should have our own flag that didn't have any connection to Britain. And in 1965, the Liberal government of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson brought in the new Canadian flag after a long and blank selection process. So if you want to just think about this for a minute, can you imagine if someone wanted to change the flag of the country? Do you think that that would be an easy thing to do, or would there be a lot of arguing back and forth? Well, what do we call an issue where there's a lot of arguing on it, where things go back and forth and back and forth? So think about our words of the day that we've done recently, and you may remember that the word is controversial. So the word is controversial, and that means there's a controversy, people disagree. So they brought in this new flag in 1965, and we're going to look at a few of the different examples. So here were different proposals that people had for different kinds of flags. And one of the things you'll notice in a lot of them is there's some blue and red, because blue is a French symbol typically, and red is an English, British symbol typically. And there was kind of this idea that, oh, well, we'll combine some blue and some red, and people, that'd be perfect. There was also, like this one I think is kind of neat because it's just like way off the beaten path, and it's got a beaver on it. This one here, so it's blue and red, and it was proposed by this gentleman. And the blue in this flag kind of is supposed to represent the two oceans, the Pacific in the west and the Atlantic on the east. But there's a lot of different options, and a lot of them still have that connection back to Britain, right? Because for many Canadians, that was something that was still really important to them. So let's watch a Heritage Minute about this.
You won't believe some of these proposals. Look at this one. And this. Whew. Now this is what I wanted from the start. But Mike Pearson wants this. Well, he is the Prime Minister, but blue is not an official Canadian color. Meanwhile, John Diefenbaker and the Tories want this. You know, the only way I'll ever get the whole committee together is to persuade my liberals to reject their own prime minister's choice. Well, the Tories will agree to that at least. Is there one design here that the whole committee can agree on that says Canada? No mistake about it. I wonder. Prime Minister and Mr. Diefenbaker, I was just talking about you. Are we all going to the same party?
Amazingly, John Matheson MP would achieve the unanimity he sought.
Great. So that is, how our current flag came about. Now, another thing that happened was that they had a new change in what was called their constitution. And a constitution is the basic document that explains how a country's government works. And Canada's constitution was rewritten in 1982 to include a document called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This document set out the basic human rights every Canadian is entitled to. These rights include, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of peaceful assembly, so you can have a protest, freedom of conscience, so you can believe what you like, and you can act in accordance with those beliefs. The right to be treated equally, right? So when, you shouldn't just be treated unfairly because of the color of your skin, or because of your religion, or because of your opinions, or because of if you have a disability or not, or because you are wealthy, or because you're poor, or whatever it is. It also includes some language rights, so that people are entitled to speak to the government in either English or French, because we're bilingual. That means there's two main languages in the country. Equality rights, language rights, there's what's called mobility rights. That means that you can move around the country. So, you could grow up in Vancouver, but then move when you're older to Saskatchewan, and the government of Saskatchewan couldn't say, no, we don't want you, because you have the right to do that under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There's also the right to vote if you're a citizen. There's the right not to be arrested without cause. So they can't just throw you in prison without good reason. And there's a right to a trial. So if you do get arrested, you can't just be thrown into prison unless they prove that you're guilty. So these are all different rights that are in this charter that our government wrote down, the Constitution. Now the charter is very popular, right? Because it sets out all the things that we like, all those rights. But it's still sometimes controversial, and again, that word means people disagree about it. Because some people worry it gives judges too much power to decide on laws instead of our elected members of parliament. So sometimes people will sue the government and say, oh, well, you're breaking my rights. It'll go before a judge, and then it's kind of like the judge gets to make the decision, which some people think is good and some people think is bad. Okay, another thing I want to talk about, and I know I'm kind of breezing through it, but I think it's good, is Quebec separatism. Now, many French Canadians have always worried about assimilation. That means kind of changing to become more English into the majority English-speaking population for centuries. And in the 1960s, some Quebecers, began to believe their province should separate from Canada and form an independent francophone country. So an independent country where people speak French as their kind of main language. And they believed that if they do that, that would help them to become maîtres chez nous, which means masters in our own house. So in 1980 and again in 1995, the government of Quebec held a referendum about whether the province should leave Canada. In both cases, the No campaign won. Quebec stayed in Canada. So there was a referendum, there was a big vote on it. And in 1995, the vote was really, 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 really close though. 49% of Quebecers said yes, they should leave Canada and form their own country. And 51% said no. So our country almost broke apart that night, right? Because one of our main provinces, our second biggest, almost left the country and said, nope, we're going to form our own thing. But ultimately they decided to stay. So there were these people who were protesting saying, we should vote we need to have our own country. There were people over here saying that my Canada includes Quebec, and saying no to the séparation, to the separation.
Acceptez-vous que le Québec devienne souverain Ce sera ça, la question. Et il y aura oui ou non.
On vous demande de prendre votre passeport canadien et de le mettre sur la table.
Sovereignty first, sovereignty forever.
Avez-vous trouvé une seule bonne raison, une seule raison valable pour briser le Canada?
So I just want to point out that one there. I think that's kind of interesting. Here, this gentleman, he is Jean Chrétien, and he's our prime minister. And he was a Quebecer, but he wanted our country to stay together. And so the night before the referendum, he got on TV and he basically begged the people of Quebec and he said, we want you to stay in our country. We don't want to break it up. Have you found a single good reason to break up Canada?
Valable pour briser le Canada.
Voted 50.6% no, 49.4% yes.
C'est vrai qu'on a été battu. Au fond, par quoi? Par l'argent et des votes ethniques.
So in the end, Quebec stayed in Canada, and it was a very controversial thing. And still, to this day, there are many Quebecers that worry about the idea that they're not going to be fully included in a country where, yes, the majority of people speak English, but our biggest second language is French, and there are some differences. And so one of the things that we kind of think about as a country is how can we bring together these two different parts of our country with their languages and kind of older cultures. Now I'm going to shift from kind of our sheer focus on Canada back to talking more about the wider world. So remember the Cold War, that kind of battle between the communist East and the capitalist West? Well, in the 1980s and 1990s, the communist countries of Eastern Europe started to weaken. This meant that their people started to rise up and take over their governments, and many of these countries became democracies. For example, in the years after Pope John Paul II visited his home country of Poland, millions of Poles filled the streets in protest until their communist government gave up and left office. And there's a beautiful kind of scene of when Pope John Paul went there, and he was a Polish man who became Pope. When he went and visited, millions of people were at this mass and they started to chant in Polish, "We want God, we want God." And I think part of what they were getting at is that their government wouldn't let them practice their religion freely. And so, when John Paul II went there, he kind of inspired a lot of people to say, you know what, we really cannot be living in a country like this anymore. We need to change the system. And so in 1989, the Berlin Wall, which divided Germany into the communist East and the democratic West, was knocked down. Then, Germany reunited as a democracy. Today, only a few countries are still communist. The biggest one, China, has changed its economy to more of a free market, but has still kept a dictatorship as its government and still limits personal freedom. So in China, it's communist, even though their economy has changed so that you can own things, you can start your own business, all that sort of thing. And as a result, China has become quite rich, even while their government still cracks down really heavily on a lot of people, right? There's no elections in China. If you disagree with the government and speak out about it, you could be thrown in prison. People are often mistreated by their government because they don't have the same rights that we do, even though, of course, they're human, so they should. So I'll give you an example. In 1989, Chinese students protested in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. That's the capital of China. They wanted their country to be more of a democracy. The government sent in the army to crush the protests, killing many students in the event. So, there's this famous photo of this one man who's trying to stand up to kind of the oppression of the state. And here it says, "Give me democracy or give me death," in both English and Chinese. And so many people in that country are still kind of oppressed by their government. And so one that kind of really applies to Vancouver is this one, which you might say, wait, why is he talking about Hong Kong? What does that have to do with Vancouver and BC? Well, what it has to do with is that many Vancouverites have their origin in Hong Kong because Hong Kong was a British colony, and in 1997, Britain gave it back to China, but China promised that they would allow Hong Kong to stay democratic until 2047. However, the mainland Chinese government keeps trying to say, no, we're going to slow down democracy in Hong Kong. We're going to make it much more like a communist dictatorship. And many Hong Kongers get really worried about that. And so they protest in the streets and they try and do what they can to stop Hong Kong from turning into a dictatorship. And at various points, many Hong Kongers have actually moved to Canada or Australia or to Britain, to other places in the world, because they felt that they were no longer going to be treated fairly if Hong Kong went in the direction of communist dictatorship that China has. And if you look at this protest here, it's an interesting photo, I think, in a lot of ways, because this is a photo of this protest in Hong Kong, and many of the people are holding the old British flag of British Hong Kong instead of the current Chinese flag, because a lot of people say, maybe the British definitely were not great. However, at least under their system, we had more personal freedom. And so what they're saying is that we want freedom and we want democracy, which are things that we believe in, typically as Canadians, and we believe that most people around the world want. Another thing that Canada has been involved with in the last little while is something called peacekeeping and the war on terror. So after the Second World War, Canada helped the United Nations to develop an idea called peacekeeping. So this is when soldiers are sent to a place after a war to prevent fighting from starting again. And Canadians have participated in peacekeeping missions all around the world. You see here's a Canadian soldier, and he's got the UN helmet for United Nations. Now watch a little video, and it's a little complex, but it kind of shares the idea of what the point of peacekeeping is.
A peacekeeping mission is a neutral military intervention in a country that requires international assistance to make the transition from conflict to peace. Since 1948, Canadian soldiers have participated in related missions on 5 continents. Canada also played an important role in the international adoption of peacekeeping. By the 1950s, Britain's colonial power was dwindling. Arab nationalists in Egypt revolted in 1952, establishing the Republic of Egypt and demanding the evacuation of British troops from the Suez Canal base. In July 1956, the Egyptian government declared sovereignty over the canal, which was a key trade route connecting Europe and Asia. With French and British support, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip on the 29th of October. After a series of special sessions in early November, the UN General Assembly determined that a ceasefire and withdrawal of foreign troops from Egypt was necessary to avert a global confrontation. At the suggestion of Lester B. Pearson, then Canadian Minister of External Affairs, the UN also established the first United Nations emergency force to achieve these objectives. Pearson later received a Nobel Peace Prize for his diplomatic efforts. UN forces remained in Egypt until 1967, and the mission was re-established under a second mandate a few years later. In many cases, UN peacekeeping mandates have not permitted soldiers to use force. However, toward the end of the 20th century, the idea of peace enforcement emerged. Peace enforcement operations require the application of military force to restore peace and security. The Canadian Armed Forces have participated in multinational peace enforcement operations as part of Canada's commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. While the UN is responsible for approving these operations, they are led by NATO allies. Over the last 6 decades, 125,000 members of the Canadian Armed Forces have served in peace operations. Some 130 Canadians have lost their lives, and many more have sustained physical or psychological injuries in service of peace.
So peacekeeping is this thing that Canadian soldiers have participated in the last 50 years to try and keep our world, or make our world, a more peaceful place, where fewer people die because of war, and where there's just kind of more opportunity for people to live in peace and harmony. Like we generally get to live here in Canada. Now, one time when that definitely didn't happen was in 2001, when our close ally, that means our friend, the United States, was attacked by terrorists who had been trained in Afghanistan. Now, a terrorist is someone who doesn't attack like the military. They attack civilians. They attack ordinary people in order to scare them and to freak them out. And what they did is we joined with our allies in attacking Afghanistan and overthrowing the radical Islamist government. And the idea there was that we were going to kick out the terrorists and kick out people who were protecting them. And so for about 8 years after, Canadian soldiers fought to prevent new terrorists from taking over. I'm just going to expand this a bit so you guys can see it better. So the thing is that when one of your friends gets attacked, typically what you try to do is you try to defend them. And so Canada was with the United States, and we kind of fought in this war in Afghanistan in order to in order to remove the possibility that these terrorists could come back and attack the U.S. again or attack us. Because again, there were a lot of Canadians who were, at 9/11 in the Twin Towers. So I'm just going to show you a short video about our war in Afghanistan that would have been fought, again, in your guys' lifetime, right? So this war took place from 2001 till about there's still American soldiers there. And Canadians, I believe, were there at least until 2014. So it took place within your lifetime.
On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 members of Al-Qaeda, a terrorist network based in Afghanistan, hijacked 4 commercial airliners with the aim of flying the planes into high-profile targets in the United States. 2 planes collide with New York City's World Trade Center. The world watches as the Twin Towers crumble. A 3rd plane strikes the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. A 4th jet crashes into a field near Philadelphia after its passengers overwhelm the hijackers. The attacks killed close to 3,000 people and thousands more are injured. 24 Canadians are among the dead. In the wake of September 11th, Canada joined a coalition led by the US and other members of NATO called the International Security Assistance Force, established by the United Nations Security Council through Resolution 1386. The primary aims are to dismantle Al-Qaeda and the Taliban government of Afghanistan and to re-establish security and law in the country. Canada contributes sea, land, and air support toward the international fight against terrorism. Canadian soldiers participate in combat, reconstruction, and peace support operations. Operational theaters include the province of Kandahar and the city of Kabul, Afghanistan's capital. Canada Canada ceases combat operations in 2011, and the Mission Transition Task Force arrives to wind down the Canadian military mission in Kandahar province. Canada's engagement continues through the NATO training mission Afghanistan. The task force mentors and trains members of the Afghan National Security Forces to prepare them to assume leadership. In March 2014, Canada's military mission in Afghanistan comes to an end. The coalition succeeds in toppling the Taliban regime, destabilizing Al-Qaeda, rebuilding infrastructure, and improving living standards. However, the counterinsurgency efforts cannot root out the Taliban from neighboring Pakistan. Of the more than 40,000 Canadian Armed Forces members who serve in the 12-year conflict, 158 soldiers are killed and 1,800 are wounded, physically and psychologically.
So again, this is a war that took place in your lifetime, where Canadian soldiers put their lives on the line in order to defend freedom, to defend our allies, and to fight against things overseas that were not in our interest. So it's just kind of important to know about that, right? Okay, last thing that I'm going to talk about is I think one last thing that's been happening in the last few years especially, which is that many Indigenous Canadians still suffer from the effects of racist policies. So we've talked about these treaties that the government made, we've talked about the epidemics of smallpox and other things like that. We've talked about residential schools and cultural removals and people being forced onto reserve. Like, there's still really terrible things that are happening because of racist policy, both now and in the past especially. However, many people have worked hard to defend the rights of Indigenous people, and many people are starting to focus on reconciliation and building a better future together. And reconciliation is kind of a religious term, and it means forgiveness and building something new together. So, how do we apologize and make things right so that we can build on, the things that have happened in our history that have not been good to make our country better? And so, for example, in 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to the survivors of the residential schools. And in the photo, you can see this new Coast Salish pole raised at, I said UBC, but I realized later that it's the Vancouver School Board. The new Coast Salish pole raised at the Vancouver School Board. And what you guys can write is you can just write in there, because it's a very small one, the VSB. And you got to think, okay, well, this is, thinking back to like residential schools and when Indigenous children were not very well treated in our education system, why it's so important to raise these poles. So here you've got Prime Minister Harper apologizing, and you've got these 3 new posts being raised outside of the Vancouver School Board office. So I'm just going to conclude with this grade 5, is that in 2020, we live in a country that is free, wealthy, multicultural, and we can be both proud and grateful for the things we have. I really believe this. I think we live in the best country on earth. But we are not perfect. Our history is filled with both pride and shame. We have a lot of work to do to make our country reach its potential and overcome our mistakes. We still have lots of work to do to defend freedom and democracy here at home and around the world. And there's a reason that we learn all about this in grade 5, and we learn all about this in our course. It's because this is not just my job. This is your job. As a Canadian, you play a part in writing the next chapters of the story of Canada, so that one day there are Yangs and Lees and Lakowskis and Bedfords in that book as our prime ministers and our scientists and our soldiers and our pilots and our doctors and the people who lead us forward to be an even better country than the one we live in today. Thank you again for all of your hard work, learning all these various different things. I hope you feel like you've learned a lot and that you're better set up to be the sort of person who is going to make our country a better, happier place, more truly itself, the true north, strong and free. Thank you again. Bye-bye.